All right, welcome everybody to our lesson number 2. We're starting a series on the Sabbath. As you could probably already notice, we had a previous lesson in regards to Jesus, whether he kept the Sabbath or broke the Sabbath in John chapter 5. That video is on our YouTube channel as well, so you're able to go ahead and watch that as well. And what we're doing today is we're continuing our study in the topic of the Sabbath. For the next few studies, we're actually going to talk about the origins of the Sabbath. So we're going to specifically deal with various arguments that are used against the origins of the Sabbath, because I believe that when you understand the origins of the Sabbath, and you have that clear in your mind, there's not very much else you can say against it, because Jesus is constantly referring to the beginning. The Bible constantly refers to the beginning to lay a strong foundation. For example, Jesus spoke about marriage and said that from the beginning, it was not like that. And he was having a debate with the leaders of that time regarding marriage and divorce. So Jesus pointed to the beginning. Paul points to the beginning as well, right? So there's various different examples that we can use to show that. And so because of that, what I want to do is I want to lay a strong foundation when it comes to the Sabbath. And then I think with that, it becomes a lot easier to understand some of the other arguments that are used against the Sabbath in the New Testament. So what we're going to do now is we're going to begin with today's topic, lesson number 2 in Origins of the Sabbath Series, which is why is the Hebrew word for Sabbath not found in the book of Genesis? So this is the text that's typically referred to, and it's in Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3. And what I want you to notice is what the critics will typically point out, which is the fact that the Hebrew word for Shabbat, which is the one found in the 4th commandment in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8, is missing from this text. Actually, they say that the word is missing from the entire book of Genesis. There is a cognate form of the word Shabbat, which we're going to look at in a moment, but it's not really the exact form that's found in the 4th commandment. At least that's how the critics are making the claim, at least how the critics are explaining it. And this is the text, Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3. It mentions that God rested on the 7th day. It says, and on the 7th day, God ended his work, which he had done. And he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it he had rested from all his work which God had created and made. So the argument pretty much goes like this, that since the Sabbath, the word Sabbath is not in the text, therefore it did not exist. That's the argument. So before we dive into that argument, let's analyze the various steps we're going to take as we study this particular argument, the various portions that we're going to look at, right? So first, we're going to examine closely the critic's argument, and then we're going to look at the context of chapters 1 and 2 in Genesis. We're going to examine what's called the logical fallacy, which will detail what that is when we get there. We're going to talk about some other things that are missing in the book of Genesis and why that's relevant to this debate. There's a section here, which is section 5, how Exodus continues the story that we find in Genesis. That's going to be very relevant to this discussion when we arrive. We're going to consider Mark 2:27. Now, there's a lot of arguments used by anti-Sabbatarians against Mark chapter 2, verse 27, not so much against the text itself, but against the Sabbatarians' interpretation of the text, which is essentially a legitimate interpretation, which we're going to look at when we arrive at this portion. So we might take a little bit of extra time in Mark 2:27 to lay a strong foundation. We're going to look at two texts, Deuteronomy 5:3 and Nehemiah 9:14. These are texts that are used by anti-Sabbatarians to say that there was no Sabbath in the book of Genesis, at the time of Genesis, or in the beginning, right? That the Sabbath is a new thing that God had instituted during the time of the Israelite Exodus, when they left Egypt. So because they use these texts, and there's some other texts that they use, but today we're going to focus on these two. We're going to examine those two very carefully. And finally, we'll conclude with the next study, because this is not going to end here. There's a lot of arguments made against the Sabbath using Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3. And we're going to look at those. We're going to briefly look at what we're going to talk about on our next study. So here's the critic's argument, which I kind of already explained before, but here it is again. The Sabbath is not a creation ordinance because the Hebrew word Shabbat, as used in the fourth commandment, is not in Genesis. Now, there are a couple of things we can say about this, but for the sake of this study, we're going to just assume exactly what the critic is saying. But there are some things that is typical of an Adventist replying. So for example, an Adventist will say, well, it's true that that word is missing, but there is a cognate form of that word, which when you look into the Hebrew text, at least in the lexicon, it explains the meaning. So for example, Gesenius Hebrew Chaldee lexicon regarding this specific word in Genesis 2, translated rest, means to rest or to keep a day of rest. I think that's because of how the word is used throughout the Hebrew Bible. So it is a word that you have to really understand in its particular context. So even though I think that may be a good argument to kind of go into the definition by the lexicon, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of assume outrightly that the critic is right, that the word used in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8, the noun that's there, which is technically true, is not found in the book of Genesis. But even if that is the case, that doesn't really create a strong argument for the anti-Sabbatarian cause. And we're going to look at a couple of reasons why. So let's transition into section 2 now. So first, let's talk about context. So in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, we find this very neat way that Moses had outlined the creation that took place in Genesis chapter 1, concluding in the beginning verses of Genesis chapter 2. You find God creating some sort of space of some however he created it, and then filling it in, right? So he creates the air, of course, the clouds, the firmament. He fills it in with animals. He creates the water. He then creates the land out of the water. So we see this happening throughout the first 6 days. And in the context, we find that the person who is, let's say, the main character, if you will, is God, right? So it's not Adam and it's not Eve. The main character in all of Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2 is God himself. He receives the glory for doing the creation. And it sets in contrast God from some of the ancient stories of that time, from some of the surrounding nations that Israel was surrounded by, right? Whereas they say that creation came about through some other means, perhaps various gods or certain elements where gods came out of, or things of that nature. This story written by Moses sets the record straight that it was God who did it. So I think it's on purpose that the focus is really, really on God, although that's obvious it's going to be on God, but I think it's on purpose that it's specific to that because it's supposed to set the contrast between the creator and the stories of the surrounding nations of that time that had their own stories of creation, right? But what's interesting about that, though, is that although the context is really God's creation and he's the focus of the story, yet each time God blesses something, we find that it's for the benefit of his creatures or his creations, right? So he blesses the animals, he blesses man, right? He tells them both to be fruitful and to multiply. And then suddenly you run into the seventh day, which is not tangible. It's just a day, right? And then he blesses that day too. So you get to thinking, well, if he blesses the first two for the benefit of mankind, seems reasonable that he would bless the third one for the benefit of mankind as well. Which makes sense because Jesus said in Mark 2:27 that the Sabbath was made for man, right? And we're going to talk about that text shortly. But it was made for man's benefit. It was made to bless man. And so all three of these things, we see them blessed But the seventh day is more than blessed. The seventh day is then sanctified. It is set apart, which we're going to look at in a few moments. So that's the context that we have. In Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2, just the first few verses, first 3 verses, we find that God is the main character. The context is about creation, but within that context, God blesses 3 things: the animals, blesses man, and the seventh day Sabbath. Here's the creation, and this is what I was kind of trying to explain a little earlier. Day 1, God creates the light. On day 4, he fills in that with the sun, moon, and stars. On day 2, he creates the waters. But on day 5, he fills in the waters with animals. And then he makes, of course, birds in the air. And then on day 3, the dry land and the plants. But then on day 6, he fills that in, right, with land animals and humans. And then on day 7, we find the seventh day blessed and sanctified in honor of God's resting from all that work that he did previously. So the significance of the structure is that the seventh day stands apart from the previous 6 days. Now, the seventh day is not eternal, not an eternal seventh day. And that's an argument used by the critics. And when we get into the next study after this, we're going to delve into that a bit deeper. But the reason why I just want to briefly mention that is because in the same fashion, and this is where consistency comes in the same fashion that the previous 6 days were 24-hour periods, so therefore the seventh day was also a 24-hour period, right? And that's the consistency. We don't find that the seventh day is a day that doesn't end. The reason why critics say that is because of the phrase, and it was evening and it was morning. You find that phrase missing from the first 6 days. You find that phrase within the first 6 days, but missing from the seventh day. But it becomes a bit redundant and perhaps you could say unnecessary to say that phrase on the seventh day for a couple of reasons. And probably the main reason is because it uses the word day, and that the word day is the result of the phrase evening and morning. So for example, the first day it says, and it was evening and it was morning, the first day. And it was evening and it was morning, the second day. Evening and morning, third day. So the result of the phrase evening and morning is the day. Once you get to the seventh day, guess what it's called? Seventh day. And it says that 3 times. And then it's sanctified. So it's definitely set apart, right? So it's a 24-hour period that ends. And then note also, because the critics say that some critics say that perhaps the seventh day did end, and it's just a 24-hour period, yet the rest didn't end. However, the text says clearly that on the seventh day, God rested from all his works which he has made. And he blessed the seventh day because that in it he had rested. Past tense. So God had rested. The reason why he blessed it is because he had rested. So both the resting that he did from creating and the 24-hour came to an end. So the day ended, and the resting that God did ended as well. What takes place beyond that in regards to God, we're not told. There's no reason to speculate. We only know what the text directly says, and we read it as it reads. It says that God rested on the seventh day, and that therefore he blessed it because he had rested. And so therefore the rest ended, and the seventh day ended as well. So what do we find? We find the formation of a week. We find day 1, day 2, day 3, all the way to day 7. So we find the first week, or what we call creation week. And on the next study, because we got to bring in some more text and go deeper into this, we're going to talk about reasons why it is a weekly cycle. It's not just 1 week set apart from all of history, and then all of a sudden a weekly cycle began after the fall of Adam and Eve. We don't find that gap in scripture. There's nothing indicates that. But nevertheless, it's worthy to respond to that. So we're going to talk about that too on the next study. So we got the creation. Now, here is where one of the things that I had mentioned prior, but to give you the visual, we find the blessing of water creatures and birds. We find the blessing of land creatures and animals. And then we find the blessing of the seventh day as well. So in context, each blessing is for the benefit of his creatures. And this includes the seventh day, since the Sabbath was made for man. Interesting, when you look a little deeper here into some of the original language, the seventh day was set apart as sacred or dedicated. So it's in the PL form in the Hebrew text, and I underlined towards the bottom left, where it says in that form, the meaning is to set apart as sacred, or to consecrate, dedicate, or to observe as holy, keep sacred. So this was a special, specific 24-hour period set apart as a sacred, holy day. That's what the text is telling us. So some critical thinking. Why did God bless this and sanctify the seventh day? The answer is simple. The text says, because in it he had rested. Right? We touched on that earlier. Some more critical thinking questions. When was this day blessed and sanctified? Simple. The answer is after God rested. So again, the text says, and God blessed the seventh day because that in it he had rested. So the 24-hour period ended, right? The resting of God from creation ended. And then God turns around and blesses that day, right? He blesses that day. And like your birthday, right? Your birthday, once it ends, then it officially becomes that 24-hour period that becomes your special day. And so God, the day ended, then on the next day, God then turns around and blesses that day and sets it apart as a sacred day, representative of the work that he had done and the subsequent rest that he had done from that work. Who was it that sanctified it? I'm sorry, who was it sanctified for? The answer is it was sanctified for God and for man. And the reason why I say for God is because God consistently calls it his day throughout the whole scriptures. He says, this is my Sabbath, right? It's his holy day. And then Mark 2:27 says it was also blessed and sanctified for man, or made for man. So it makes sense for God to bless and sanctify the seventh day for both himself and man, since in context, each thing created satisfies God. For example, it says that it was good, it was very good, and then it says God blessed. So in the context, it's always pointing to God, right? Since he's the main character. So therefore, the day has been set apart and sanctified for God. It's his day, right? And then each previous blessing benefits its creatures, so therefore it was also blessed for man as well. And Jesus confirmed it when he says the Sabbath was made for man in Mark 2:27. Let's talk about this next section, which is very important. Now, when I do my studies, right, and I do these trainings, and I'm no professional in this, by the way. It's a simple Google search. I've received some training, but this is easy. It's just a matter of researching and learning. It's important for us to detect fallacies and reasonings when people are making arguments. And we have to be careful here, because I've had critics think that they found fallacies in some of my reasonings, only to find out that it wasn't. And so it's tricky, and you have to really know what you're talking about. So one of the best ways that I think is best to detect a fallacy and then claim that someone committed that fallacy is by looking for the experts, what the experts have to say. This is something the critics have not done in many of their arguments against Sabbatarian Christians, or against myself in some of my arguments. But I'm going to do that. So there is a website called Logically Fallacious. I am in contact with the gentleman, the author of this website. And so I'm trying to see how we can work together, really not work together, but I'm trying to learn from him as best as I can on these matters, these how to detect logical fallacies. So I took this example that he put in his website in explaining the fallacy called argumentum et silentio, which is in English, the argument from silence. And so here's an example. Jay says, dude, where are my car keys? And Silent Bob says, nothing. And then Jay assumes that because nothing was said, he assumes the following: I knew you took them. So he assumes that he took the car keys, right? So explanation, and I won't bore you with reading the whole thing here, but I just want you to see the parallel between the two now. So the explanation is the refusal to share evidence is not necessarily evidence for or against the argument. That's important, because I'm not making an argument from silence either, right? Not from the book of Genesis, at least. What I am going to show you is evidence outside of Genesis, which we're going to see in a moment. But notice what it says. Refusal to share evidence is not necessarily evidence for or against the argument. Silent Bob's silence does not mean he took the keys. Perhaps he did. Or perhaps he knows who did. Or perhaps he saw Tyrannosaurus eat them. I like how the little comedy he puts in there. Well, let's see a parallel here with the arguments that critics use in regards to the Sabbath. J, where is the Hebrew word Shabbat in the book of Genesis? Silent Bob. Let's say he's silent Adventist, right? Or Sabbath keeper. He looks all over Genesis, can't find the word. Says nothing. Jay comes back and says, see, I knew you couldn't find it because it didn't exist. That's an argument from silence. When a critic points to the book of Genesis, specifically chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, or 2 to 3 rather, and says, look, the word is not there, so therefore it didn't exist. That's not necessarily the case. It may not be there for other reasons, not because it didn't exist or it wasn't instituted. There may be other reasons why it's not mentioned. Who knows if it's because Moses did not feel the need to mention it because he's going to mention it later, which we're going to find when we enter into Exodus, right? So there could be a number of reasons. So it's not reasonable to argue that because the word is not there, therefore it didn't exist, or it wasn't instituted at that time. So the fact that Moses does not mention a thing in Genesis is not necessarily evidence for or against any argument. The silence does not mean that the Sabbath did not exist. Perhaps it did exist and Moses waited to mention it later, like I mentioned. Let me give you some more reasons why it is very bad to argue in the manner the critics have done. Let me give you some more reasons. The book of Genesis may not mention the word Sabbath, but it also doesn't mention other things as well, in certain sections of it or in the entire book. For example, there are certain institutions mentioned that are not mentioned. The Sabbath is an institution, right? Well, here we find that there are other institutions not mentioned. For example, the ability to prophesy between chapters 4 and 6. Yet Jude 14 says that it did. Enoch was prophesying. So what happened was that the critics have not considered the evidence available outside the book of Genesis that explains what took place in Genesis. They're stuck on Genesis and that's it. And they make their arguments from there. It's a fallacious way of arguing. Preachings. Yet 2 Peter 2:5 says that preaching did exist because it says that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. Intercessory prayer between chapters 4 and 17 at least, and yet we find it existing in chapter 18. I believe that's the case where Abraham was interceding between God and Sodom. So just because it doesn't mention something in the book of Genesis doesn't mean it didn't exist. We got missing commands, for example. Where in Genesis does it say to love your neighbor? If I argue the way the critics have done, I should say what the critics say. I should say, well, because Genesis did not mention the command to love your neighbor, therefore it didn't exist. God didn't expect that from his people. Of course, if you're a critic listening, you're probably thinking, well, of course, I wouldn't argue that way. Then why do we argue that way in regards to the Sabbath? There's some other examples. The command to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The command prohibiting idolatry, blasphemy. Where does it say in Genesis, honor your mother and your father? There's adultery is missing, even though Joseph refused to commit adultery by not sleeping with Potiphar's wife. Yet because there's no specific command there, then why was he doing it? Isn't it obvious that because he understood that was against God's will and God's principles? They were at least aware of God's principles regarding lying, theft, covetousness, witchcraft, pride. We have missing doctrinal truths. For example, the doctrine of the future punishment, the resurrection of the body, the judgment of the great and final day, the revelation of the remnant. All missing from the book of Genesis or portions of it. And if we argue like the critics have done, we have done a big disservice to God's word. However, how do we know these things existed though? It's simple. The Bible says all scripture is given by inspiration of God. So we're supposed to use not just the book of Genesis, but the book of Genesis with the book of Exodus and Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, the Samuels, the Chronicles, all the way up to the New Testament to the book of Revelation. When we use all of the books in the Bible, it's like putting all the pieces together. We can build a case and we can make better determinations on truth than if we limit ourselves to just one book or one portion of the Bible. Watch this. We mentioned earlier Enoch's message. It says that although Genesis does not mention the coming of the Lord and its subsequent destruction of the ungodly, it was nonetheless being preached. You could read Genesis from chapter 1 all the way to the very last chapter, and it does not say that Enoch was preaching the second coming of Christ. It doesn't say that. Nevertheless, it was happening. Why? Because the book of Jude tells us in Jude chapter 1, there's only one chapter there, verse 14, it says, and Enoch also the seventh of Adam prophesied of these things, saying, behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints. So in like manner, Genesis may not mention the noun for the Sabbath or its observance by man, yet Exodus 20 verse 11 names the first seventh day by the noun Shabbat. And this is very important. And Mark 2:27 uses the noun Sabbath, though in Greek, yet it still uses the word Sabbath while speaking of it as being made for the benefit of man. So, and that's very key right there. We must use the rest of Scripture to help us understand what's happening in Genesis and elsewhere. Jude takes the fact that Enoch was preaching and injects that idea into the Genesis account and tells us what was taking place, right? And so the same thing happens in Exodus 20 verse 11 by the same author, mind you, which is Moses. Moses then takes the noun that's in Exodus chapter 20 verses 8 through 11, and he says in verse 11 that seventh day from Genesis chapter 2, that seventh day is the day that God blessed. So the text says, wherefore, and it says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Therefore, wherefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, you see. The Lord blessed the Sabbath day. So Moses takes that seventh day from Genesis chapter 2 and calls it the Sabbath with that noun that the critics insist should be found in the book of Genesis. That's the key. That's why arguing from silence is so fallacious. And it's not an appropriate way of, we don't make arguments based on missing evidence. We make arguments based on available evidence. And so that's what we're doing here. We're taking evidence from various portions of the scriptures, and we're allowing the scriptures to do the explaining that takes place, explaining of the events in the book of Genesis. And that's typical. It happens all the time. Paul constantly refers to Genesis when he's making his explanations. At one point, he's talking about head coverings and male leadership. It points to the fact that in the beginning, God made them male and female. He points to that, and he uses that in his explanations of things, right? We find that in the book of Hebrews as well, right? Constantly pointing to certain facts that perhaps Genesis does not mention. And yet, we know these are inspired authors who have a right to do that. And that's the safest route for us to take as Christians, is to, instead of interpreting these things in our way, in our manner, let's allow the authors, the apostles of the New Testament and Christ himself to do the interpreting for us, and the authors of the Old Testament too. Here's just another example I thought was interesting to bring in. You could check the book of Esther, the book of Songs of Solomon. Words like God and Lord are missing from those books. Now, you may be able to infer God from the book of Esther, but it's definitely, even an inference is not found in the book of Songs. So what's the point of bringing this up? The point is the same. Nobody would argue that because the word God is missing from Esther, for example, that therefore God did not exist. No one in their right mind would argue that. We know God existed based on the evidence available, perhaps internally, as we can do with Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, but also with evidence available outside of the book of Esther in other portions of the scriptures. And so that's why it's important not to argue from silence. Critics do it all the time. They don't only say that the word Sabbath is missing from Genesis. They'll say Like what we mentioned earlier, they'll say, well, the phrase evening and morning is missing from the seventh day. Therefore, the seventh day is not a 24-hour period. It's an argument from silence again. It's just because something is missing, you can't make this grand doctrine out of that. You must determine why it wasn't mentioned, and the reason why is simple. It already says the word day, which is the culmination of the evening and morning phrase. It already said it's sanctified, which closes the day and makes it a specified day, right? It already says that God blessed the seventh day because he had rested. So the day is closed. It's already ended, right? Throughout the whole Bible, it treats that first seventh day as a simple numeral, the seventh day, and as a 24-hour period. We find that in the book of Exodus chapter 20 again, in the fourth commandment. It treats that seventh day as a regular 24-hour period. So arguing from silence really is just terrible theology. Now, look at this. Exodus continues the story. This is very important. This is a point I think the critics perhaps have not thought of or realized. And the verses I quoted was just so that we can see that there's a continuation taking place, right? So Moses, we believe, is the author of Genesis and Exodus, right? And some other books. Well, what takes place here? What takes place here is that the story that began in Genesis does not end in Genesis. It doesn't end in chapter 50. The story continues into chapter 1 of Exodus and then on from there. This linkage is very important. When you see that there is a continuation of the story in Genesis all the way into the book of Exodus and then beyond from Exodus towards the end of Exodus, you'll find that there's a unit here of really one story, maybe two books, and it is, but it is one story, one continuous chronological story from Genesis chapter 1 all the way to the end of Exodus, of the book of Exodus. So why am I bringing that up? Because when you continue the story and you reach chapter 20, verse 11 in Exodus, you there find an explanation of the seventh day back in Genesis chapter 2. And there in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, Moses now says, who's the same author again, he now says, hey, that seventh day from the beginning, that is the Sabbath day. And he uses that now to explain that that's the Sabbath day. So this is key right here. Our critics will point to the book of Genesis and say, look, it's missing from Genesis. But wait a minute, it's in Exodus. And Exodus is a continuation. It's a continued story of what we found in the book of Genesis. Very important for us to keep this in mind. Now, I want to consider for a few moments Mark chapter 2, verse 27. And I know that there are some arguments made against the Sabbatarian position on this text. And we're going to briefly look at those arguments, but we're actually going to have a whole PowerPoint section on this, on Mark 2:27, with its context and its commentary of that event by Matthew as well, at another portion. We're going to briefly look at some of this now, but we're going to definitely go deeper at that point. So a couple of points to consider. First and foremost, in this chapter, true, the context is not creation. And we're going to answer that argument in a moment, but that's true. What happened? Well, the disciples go through the grain field, start picking some grain, and the leadership of that time become very upset. So Jesus points to a few situations in the Old Testament, for example, where David ate the showbread that only belonged to the priests, to justify pretty much the actions of the apostles, of the disciples when they ate on the Sabbath. They picked the grain and they ate on the Sabbath. There are some arguments, again, just kind of mentioning by way again, that there are some arguments that are used by the critics against this, which we're going to look at. Some of those we're going to respond to now. We're going to go a bit deeper on it on the next study. But nevertheless, Jesus points to these stories, justifies the actions of the disciples. Now, how does Jesus justify the actions of the disciples? Well, he goes on to show that which is good can be done on the Sabbath. It's not a violation of the Sabbath. You see, the Pharisees had misinterpreted the Sabbath, and unfortunately, our critics today misinterpreted in the same manner they have done. So they lined themselves with the critics of Jesus at that time. But Jesus comes around and says, no, there is no there's no violation that took place here. First and foremost, we know why. Well, because the fourth commandment doesn't forbid doing anything beneficial for your life or your family, anything that's necessary, right? Any healing or helping of people. It doesn't forbid that. It forbids secular work. It says not to do your work. For in 6 days, it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath. So it's not forbidding what the disciples did here, or what Jesus later did by healing. It's not forbidding that at all. In fact, when you study in the Old Testament, I didn't put these on the slides, but I will when we study deep into Mark 2:27 on the next study. But if you study in the Old Testament, they were doing good works on the Sabbath all the time in the Old Testament. That's why Jesus says, my Father always works and I too must work. Well, in context, what work? Right? It was in helping people as Jesus was doing, and things that benefited the kingdom of God. So for example, we find in certain verses, and I'm just naming a few off the top of my head, some soldiers who were Israelites were standing guard on the Sabbath, right? We find a couple of other situations that aren't coming to mind right now, but there are. Oh, here's another one. God Himself. So on the seventh day in Genesis chapter 2, true, God stopped working we can say, for lack of a better term, secular work of creating. But nonetheless, He kept working in a sense because He worked by doing good for His creatures, His creation. How do we know that? Because Colossians 1 and a couple other texts says that by Him all things consist, right? In other words, it's because of God and His constant effort to maintain us and keep us alive with the breath of life He's given us that we still exist, we're still alive. In other words, God never stopped working for the benefit of humanity. He stopped working His secular work, if we can use that term, of creating, but He didn't stop working in blessing His creations, because the sun still rises on the seventh day, the flowers still grow on the seventh day, and man and animals must still eat, and God continuously provides that for them even on the seventh day. And so Jesus, when He healed a man on the Sabbath, when the disciples did what was necessary at that time, when they were hungry on the Sabbath and in the middle of missionary work, by the way, they were doing something good which didn't violate the Sabbath. Jesus said in Matthew 12:12, He says, it is lawful. That means legally allowed. It is legally allowed to do well or good on the Sabbath. That's Matthew 12:12. So there was no violations of the Sabbath here. But now let's get deeper here, because our subject really is the origins of the Sabbath. That Mark 2:27 context, we're going to study that deeper on the next round. But our topic here is the origins of the Sabbath. Now, the text says in the Greek, there's a definite article before the word man. The Sabbath was made for the man. Acts chapter 17, verse 27 explains, and hath made of one blood all nations. In other words, the man for which the Sabbath was made, which evidently was Adam, he is himself representative of all mankind. So the Sabbath was made for man, for all mankind. Now, the word man can mean a single individual or a kind of man, like a Roman man, a Gentile man, a Jewish man. It could talk about status, for example. But here we find that it's connected to the word made. And we're going to see why that's very significant in a moment. But Jesus jumps to the beginning of creation to say that it was made for the benefit of mankind. All right. Let's delve into this now. I did mention earlier that this section is going to take a little bit, so bear with me. And I hope it's not too overwhelming here, but we have to go through it. And there's more to this, by the way. Neither could I fit it all here, and neither do I think I needed to add any more. But I have a book that I've written that I'm still finishing up chapters called An Examination and Refutation of 16 Propositions Against Sabbath Keeping. It's a response to a particular critic on the AdventDefenseLeague.com website. So you can find it there and you'll see this there. You'll see that there's more to this as well. But anyhow, examining exegetically this text. So point number one, this Greek word here translated made can also be used for creation. Not saying it is every time, just saying that it can also be used for creation. And you can find that that same word is used in John 1:3, 10, 1 Corinthians 15:45 in the context of creation. What Jesus is doing is pointing to creation. Now, we're going to see more reasons why that's the case. But in the LXX, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, what we call also the Septuagint, you're going to find in the Greek of Genesis 2, 4, 5, and verse 7, that this same Greek word is used there as well. All right, point number 2. Although the Greek word for man can refer either to mankind or to a certain kind of people, and it can be used for mankind in general as well. Even critics would admit to that. They just say, for whatever reasons, they say, well, it can be mankind, but in this case, it just means one certain kind of man, and then they'll say it's the Jews. So, but we both admit that it can mean either of the two, mankind or certain kinds of people, right? Or an individual. Yet, we have an allusion to creation week when it is here juxtaposed to the word made. That's very important, since that was the moment that man was made. So to be sure, the second clause of verse 27 says, and not the man for the Sabbath, which implies that the man was also made. In other words, in this text, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. That text is saying two things were made. First thing was made was man. The second thing was made was the Sabbath. And you see that one after the other, man and Sabbath, that parallels creation. So there's an allusion right directly to creation for two reasons. First, it alludes to it because there's a parallel, or at least we can say there's a parallel here, because you have man and Sabbath, but in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, you have man and Sabbath also, right? So of course, it's not made, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, because man did not come after the Sabbath. Man came first. And then you have the word man. And the question for us is, when was man made? Well, man was not made after creation, of course. Man was made in Genesis chapter 1 before the fall of mankind, before the fall of Adam, when he and his wife ate of the tree that they weren't supposed to eat. Therefore, the text is actually pointing to creation. Jesus suddenly takes a quick detour to creation to lay a foundation for the justification that he's making now when he defends his disciples for what they did on that day. He says it was made for their benefit from the beginning. His hearers would have known exactly what he meant the moment he said that it was made. They knew that he's going straight to the beginning when they heard him say that man was made. The critics will say, well, no, it was made in Exodus chapter 16. Yeah, but then the word man though, when was that made? When was man made? Well, it was made in the Genesis account. All right, point number 3. The Greek has a definite article, the man. We mentioned this already earlier, but it's worth repeating. The man, the only man who was made at creation, of course, we know is Adam. However, he himself is a representative of mankind, according to Acts chapter 17, verse 26. Verse 28, Jesus alludes to his divinity as the creator. So again, what we're doing here is we're outlining various reasons why this text is pointing to creation and placing the Sabbath at creation. It says that it alludes to his divinity as creator when he claims ownership and authority over the great institution of the Sabbath by saying, the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Now, Matthew chapter 12 is the same story repeated in Mark 2, but with some other details, right? And so we can go there as well for more information. In that account, at this moment, Jesus says something that Mark did not write. Jesus says that he is greater than the temple. Yet not even the heavens can contain God, according to 2 Chronicles 6:18. So therefore, by claiming to be greater than the temple, and by claiming to be Lord of the Sabbath, Jesus was in essence saying he is God the Creator. What does this tell us? This tells us that Mark 2:27 is pointing to creation. And it is there in creation when the Sabbath was made. So though the word Shabbat is missing in Genesis chapter 2, apart from the evidences and proofs we find from Exodus chapter 20 and other evidences, we have here a direct proof, a very strong piece of evidence that the Sabbath is a creation ordinance. And this is a difficult text for our critics to deal with. I've had critics come back and say that this is actually a good point. right? Because it's true. It is pointing to creation. Now, it's worth looking at some arguments that the critics typically use. Don't let all of the text here overwhelm you. It's on purpose. And the reason why it's on purpose is because this PowerPoint, I give it to all the members of the exclusive Advent Defense League. So if you're somebody watching from another means, this presentation, I will gladly give you this PowerPoint presentation. Join our group. It's a training group that we have on Facebook. It's a private training group where we learn and we are trained in apologetics through studies like these and through invited speakers that we invite into our group to train us in apologetics. So don't let all the text overwhelm you because it's on purpose. It's for the purpose of study. It's study material. All right, here are 3 objections, and there's more objections, but these are the 3 main ones that you're going to find that the critics will counter when we explain this. So first thing they say is that the context is not about the Sabbath. Well, actually, it's not about creation. There's a typo there. It should say creation. They'll say the context is not about creation. While that's true, the context is not about creation, yet it's equally true that Jesus is taking a moment to jump to creation to make his point, like constantly happens in the New Testament. For example, Jesus does that in Matthew chapter 19. The context there is not about creation, but it's about divorce. But Jesus points to the creation module as a basis for his argument. Paul does the same thing in 1 Corinthians. He says the context here is about head coverings and male headship. Yet Paul points to creation as, again, a basis for his argument. Mark 13:19, here the context is the future tribulation. Yet Jesus points to the beginning of the creation, he said, to warn his hearers of the enormity of the future trial. And so what happens? Even though the context is not about creation per se, yet there's nothing inaccurate in saying that he is pointing to creation to make his argument, to lay a foundation for his argument and justification. Speaking of the argument, only Jews are present. This is not a typical argument, to be honest. I've heard this from really one specific critic, but nonetheless, it's worth responding to. So the argument goes that because only Jews were present when Jesus said those terms, therefore, when he said man, he means Jews. How that conclusion is drawn, I can't grasp in my mind yet, but that's the argument, that because of that, the presence of the people at that time determines what man refers to, what Jesus was referring to when he said the word man. A couple of things to say about that. First of all, Jesus' crowds included non-Jews. Who's to say that there were no non-Jews there who believed in the Jewish religious system and perhaps believing in Jesus? After all, in the book of John, we find there, chapter 12, verse 20, that there were Greeks who came and wanted to see Jesus. The Bible constantly refers to a multitude following Jesus, and I grant that most of them were Jews, but we can't say that there were no Jews there just because the text doesn't specifically mention it, because then that would be another argument from silence. And that's another fallacy. This lack of mentioning that there are lack of mentioning non-Jews in the presence of Christ when he spoke these words in Mark 2:27. That lack of mentioning that, if there even is, because we're going to look at something else in a moment, it's not an argument itself. It's an argument from silence. It doesn't work. Nevertheless, critics typically just stick to Mark chapter 2, like they do with Genesis. They just stick to Genesis. But Matthew comments on the situation as well. And in Matthew, we find that there was a multitude present from various cities, Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum. Now, are we going to say that from these cities, that people who came to see Jesus, there were all Jews and there was not even one who was not a Jew? It's not reasonable. As a matter of fact, when you compare in Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 12 mentions Capernaum. Matthew chapter 8, verse 5 and 10 and 11 mentions non-Jews coming to see Jesus, asking for help. At one point, someone came from Capernaum asking, I think it was a Roman soldier, asking if Jesus could heal his servant. Came from Capernaum. So there were people from these cities that were non-Jews that were present at that time. What happened with the critic is that he took he took Mark, read the whole chapter, said, oops, there's no Gentiles here, therefore man must refer to Jews. But forgot to go to Matthew chapter 12, that also comments on this situation, chapter 11 and chapter 12, to see this piece of evidence. All right, but if it does mean that there were only Jews there, then Jesus missed an opportunity to tell them that it's theirs by saying it was made for man. So granting that it was just Jews there, it's a missed opportunity, because Jesus could have told just those Jews, hey, by the way, it was made for you guys. That's not what he does. He says the word man, and that bypasses the Jews now and opens it up to anybody, everybody, mankind. There's a couple of, look at this. So the Bible consistently says when something is for the Jews. For example, language of the Jews, Isaiah 36:11. City of the Jews, Luke 23:51. Feast of the Jews, Jews feast tabernacles. It even mentions law of the Jews, right? And critics will typically say, well, you see, therefore, that's the Sabbath was part of the law, and therefore it belongs only to them. But, you know, again, the Sabbath, though it was placed there, like marriage was placed within the Jewish system, like various other things, yet that doesn't mean it didn't exist. The fourth commandment itself says to rest the seventh day, but it also says to work 6 days. Does it not? Well, the fact of working, the institution of labor, existed before man fell into sin. God tells Adam and Eve to keep the garden. So labor existed before sin, yet it was included in the law of the Jews because the fourth commandment says to work, right? So it's not an argument to say that just because it was there within the Jewish system that therefore belongs strictly to them. No, it existed before the Jews, before there was ever a Jew on the earth, from the creation. Nevertheless, the text should say the Sabbath was made for Jews. Though it wouldn't make sense to say that anyway, it would be nonsensical for Jesus to just say that all of a sudden. But perhaps to some critics it is sensible. Yet it doesn't say that, right? It doesn't say that the Sabbath was made for man. Okay, next one. And here's one that's a bit more difficult for folks. The previous two, I think, are easier. Argument number 3, Gentiles were referred to as dogs by the Jews. And so, therefore, Jesus, when he says man, he means Jew, because had he meant Gentiles, he would have said dogs. That's the argument, right? All right, a couple of important details. So actually, God calls unfaithful Jews dogs. You can see that in Isaiah 56, verses 10 to 11. It seems to me critics don't point these specific verses out, you know, in this discussion, in this debate, but that text is very clear. It was the Jews, more specifically the Jewish leaders who were unfaithful, who were referred to as dogs. All right. Now, a text that's typically appealed to is Matthew 15, where Jesus has this meeting with a Phoenician woman, and she makes a request. And Jesus says, it is not, if I quote it correctly, it is not meet to give what belongs to the Jews to the dogs, which in the Greek means to the small or little dogs, right? And so she comes back and says, well, I mean, even the dogs will eat the crumbs that fall from the table, right? So because of this particular situation, the Gentiles will say, the critics will say, well, you see, even Jesus agreed. But Jesus was not being mean, right? Actually, this story proves the Sabbatarian cause. Let me tell you why. Because in the presence of Jesus at that time were his Jewish followers. They were there. They were watching Jesus' treatment of this woman. And though he used a phrase that was common to the language at that time, it was a stigma at that time that those same Jewish disciples perhaps used, yet Jesus now takes that and breaks that stigma. How do we know that? Because he actually grants her request. So in other words, Jesus does take the opportunity in the hearing of those Jews to refer to her in this way, not to insult her like they do. Jesus does not insult her, not to downgrade her or to say she's less, but rather so that they see, okay, now let's see how Jesus treats her. Jesus then breaks that stigma, that cultural barrier, and then gives her the request, grants her request, which typically the Jews would not have done since they referred to her as a dog. And that's an important part of the story that our critics are not considering, right? It is true that they would refer to Gentiles as dogs at that time, yet that wasn't Jesus' attitude. So therefore, when Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man, he was not thinking of strictly Jews and not Gentiles because he didn't use the word dog. He would not have used the word dogs towards them because it was a derogatory term towards them, and he was not there for that. Rather, he said man because it was made for mankind, pointing to creation. And this piece of evidence in Matthew 15 actually destroys the notion that Jesus would refer to Gentiles as dogs simply by granting her request. Those are the objections that typically are brought up against the Sabbatarian understanding, faithful understanding of the context and the verse of Mark 2:27. There are others. We'll look at them soon. I thought this was an important quote to bring into the subject as well. This is actually from a critic of Adventism, which critics are well aware of. And as far as I can tell from my studies, and I could be wrong, but as far as I can tell from my studies, even when he wrote an anti-Sabbatarian arguments later when he left Adventism, I have not found him refute his own analysis that he did here. He does refer to the Mark 2:27 in some of his books, but he does not refer to this particular argument that he made here, which is extremely powerful. Here's what he said. This is in a book called The Morality of the Sabbath. It's hard to find this book to purchase in book format in paperback or hardcover. But you can find it on, I believe it's adventistarchives.com, one of those. You might be able to just Google it. And then you can find it in electronic form. In fact, I'll provide the link in our group and on the YouTube description as well. But notice what he says. He says, a noun unlimited by an adjective is to be taken in its broadest sense. For example, man is mortal, meaning all men, the race. So in this case, Christ does not limit it to one class of men, as our critics have done, but says that it was made for man, that is the race. And I think that's a powerful argument to consider as we examine carefully Mark 2:27. It is a term that is being used to mean mankind. It's not limited. He didn't say the Sabbath was made for the Jewish man. Didn't say that. It's just Sabbath was made for man. It's an unlimited term, and so therefore it is made for mankind. We're drawing to a close, but I wanted to explain a little bit of this. Look at carefully these two arguments here. We'll do it briefly. They're quite easy to respond to actually, but it's worth mentioning them. So here's a verse, Deuteronomy 5:1-3, particularly the last one that says, "The Lord made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us who are all here alive this day." Why is this verse used by the critics? It's used by the critics to say that the Sabbath was not made from creation, rather it was made with the Jews only. Why? Because the text says, "The Lord made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us who are all of us alive today, this day." So therefore, according to the critics, Sabbath didn't exist before because the covenant was made with them only. There's a couple of problems there. So first of all, the text reads, "and this covenant," it doesn't say "and the Sabbath." It says, "and this covenant was made." Granted, the Sabbath was a part of that covenant, but first let's examine that point, and then we're going to talk about some other parts. It reads, "this covenant was not made with our fathers, but with us." It doesn't say the Sabbath. Second, it says, in context, the covenant was the Ten Commandments. That's the context, according to the next chapter, chapter 6, and actually according to verses 6-21, and then the previous chapter 4:13. Now, an institution can exist outside and prior to a covenant made with it. Anything can exist outside of a covenant and then included in the covenant. For example, a house. You can contract with the bank to purchase a house, to get a mortgage. That doesn't mean the house didn't exist prior, but you can take that house and contract with a bank or a seller to purchase that house. You can also contract to build the house but I'm just giving an example of why something can exist prior to the contract. So the Sabbath can and indeed does exist prior to the covenant that was made between God and the Israelites. And we find various texts that already showed that. The Sabbath existed according to the text outlined here, Exodus 16:1, 19:1, verses 10 to 11. The Sabbath existed at least 1 month prior to when the covenant was made. Now, of course, as a Sabbatarian Adventist, as I studied the scriptures, the Sabbath existed way prior to that. We find it in the Genesis account. Nevertheless, granting just for a brief moment that it came in after, right, after the fall, yet we find that it's still not dependent on the covenant, because Exodus 16 verse 1 outlines that they were on the second month after the departure from Egypt, and then they reached the third month in Exodus chapter 19, and that's when the Sabbath is given to the Israelites in the form of the fourth commandment. So we find that either way how the critic argued, whether it existed in Genesis or existed in Exodus only, nevertheless, it's not dependent on the covenant. It can exist apart from the covenant, and indeed does, and therefore this text does not prove that the Sabbath did not exist prior. All right. Thou madest known unto them thy holy Sabbaths. This is a text in Nehemiah 9:14 that some critics use, not all, some critics used to say, you see, God made the Sabbath known to them, therefore it started existing with them. It makes no sense. So first of all, the phrase made known actually implies prior existence. For example, in Ezekiel 20 verse 5 says, thus saith the Lord, on the day when I chose Israel and made myself known to them. Same terminology, right? Yet God existed prior before making himself known. You see, this PowerPoint that I'm using right now existed prior to me making it known to you through this study. So in other words, just because something was made known to an individual or a class of individuals doesn't mean it didn't exist prior. I grant that the Sabbath was lost sight of. They were, after all, 400 plus years in Egypt with no rest. That's why Pharaoh got upset in chapter 5 when he told them that Moses was making them rest. This wasn't a habit of theirs. It's very likely that they lost sight of it in the same way that they lost sight of many things, but not totally, of course. But it's very likely that they did lose sight of the Sabbath along with other things. In Genesis chapter 6, we find that mankind abandoned God. So how much more would they abandon the Sabbath if they abandoned the creator of the Sabbath? So therefore, just because it says made known doesn't mean it didn't exist prior. Yet God both existed prior and his name was known prior, according to Genesis 4:1-26, although at some point his name was not known. We find that in Exodus chapter 6, verse 3. I'm going to read for you briefly, or as quickly as I can, as we draw to a close, a section of the book well, this chapter is completed, but that I'm still writing and is found on the Adventist Defense League website. It's the book called An Examination and Refutation of 16 Propositions Against the Sabbath. And here's a snippet, a section of that particular quote, which, by the way, a little bit of an insight, I have a friend of mine, I won't mention names, who is critically reading this book. And that's on purpose, because I'm open to the other side and see what the critics have to say. Though the critics don't want to have conversations with us, and I'm willing, and Adventists typically are willing to have conversations with them. And this particular section here is actually an edited form of what it originally was, based on the feedback received from my friend, who is not a Sabbath keeper, yet is a good friend, a respectful person, and who thought that at least this particular point was a good point. Here it is. To put it another way, just as God's name was once known and uttered by primitive descendants of Adam who called upon the name of the Lord, so the Sabbath was certainly known by early generations. Yet over time, the truth of God was buried and forgotten by the iniquity and paganism of the nations, making it necessary to then make known or reveal once again, not just his name, but the Sabbath. That's when Nehemiah 9:14 comes in. but also his laws and the precepts to the people who chose to espouse to himself. Evidently, therefore, in Exodus 16, God was not creating the Sabbath, nor newly establishing it, but rather he was reestablishing, reintroducing, or making it known once more to a people that lost the knowledge of both it and its creator while under sin and Egyptian bondage. And here's a parallel where you can see where both God's name was known before, and yet it was forgotten, and yet God made it known again. Same thing with the Sabbath. It was known before, yet it was forgotten, yet it had to be made known again. Very, very powerful parallel. All right, we've gone to a close here. This is great study. For those of you who are in the conference, just give me a few more moments and then we'll turn it on. We'll turn on our cameras if you're still there. And then we can have a question answer format, or you can share your comments. But for our next study, we're going to have a next section of this particular argument, and we're going to study a couple of things. We're going to look at a bit deeper now into the missing phrase evening and morning on the seventh day. We're going to look at, did both the day and the rest that God had experienced, did that end on the seventh day? We're going to look at the blessing and the sanctification of the seventh day. Was it cyclical? Was it just that one and only secluded, lonely seventh day, or was it something that was a seventh day continuously every week? We're going to talk about a concept called prolepsis. We'll explain that when the moment comes and see if there's validity in that. We're going to talk about the absence of a definite article. Does it prove that an institution did not exist prior? And then did God rest or cease, or both? And there's other ones. So we're going to look deeply into that. And then a quick announcement for our next workshop, that these workshops don't appear on YouTube. And so if you would like to experience this training that we do in our workshop, in our private group, here we have this next speaker. Now, if you join our group, you missed the previous speakers, but you can still catch those trainings modules because they're inside of this private group on Facebook. You do need a Facebook account, but we're going to arrange in the future a way where you may not need a Facebook account. But for now, that's what we'll need. But if you'd like to join the group, you're more than welcome to by just simply sending a message to info@adventistdefenseleague.com, or find the Advent Defense League ministry on Facebook in our group or in our page. Send us a message, or you can send us a message right here on YouTube, and I'll give you the information. In fact, I'll pin it to the top comments and put it in the description. But you're invited to join us. This next presentation is going to be a training on the origins debate, evolution versus creation from a Seventh-day Adventist perspective. A good friend of mine, Christopher Seneca, who is himself a scientist who holds various degrees. So you're going to really enjoy this. I think this would be great. This is going to be on March 13th, coming up soon. If you'd like to join it, it's only going to happen in our group on Facebook called Exclusive Members of the Advent Defense League. Join us there, and I think you would really enjoy that. Well, God bless you. Thank you so much for joining this study, and I hope to see you on the next round.